Hello, this is Robbie Martin. In this episode, we're going to be discussing some pretty graphic and traumatic stuff involving childhood sexual abuse. So we just wanted to start this episode with a trigger warning and a resource for people out there still struggling with this. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24 hours a day. That phone number is 1-800-656-4673.
Welcome to Media Roots Radio. This is Abby Martin.
And this is Robbie Martin. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome, everyone. A lot of people are talking about this new documentary that was a joint production by Channel 4 and HBO, 4 hours long in its original form, called Leaving Neverland. This is about the child abuse allegations against Michael Jackson. And before we get into the documentary, the nuts and bolts, and, you know, because it really is a rabbit hole, and I have not gone down a rabbit hole like this since 9/11, I think. But I just wanted to talk to you about what your perception of Michael Jackson was before you saw this documentary. Because you were, you know, you're a man, and you were a boy when Michael Jackson was in his godly form. The late 80s, early 90s, he was a god. I cannot think of another entertainer or Hollywood personality that was more powerful and famous than Michael Jackson. He was in his own league, and he shaped just so much and influenced millions of people, and has this kind of cult following of worshipers of his music and his persona. And so what do you remember about Michael Jackson growing up, and what did you think about him before you saw this?
I mean, it's hard to separate Michael Jackson as a figure from just like all of my reality and memories as a child, because he was not just the most famous person in my lifetime and this figure that eclipsed everything else, but he also was almost like a part of the cultural landscape, in not just musically, but like in almost every way. I mean, Disneyland had Captain EO, and I remember that being like a huge deal. The marketing that went behind that, the line, how long I had to wait to see it when I was a kid. I don't remember when it first opened, but I remember seeing it not long after it opened at Disneyland, and it was a really big deal when it came out. It was like, because you could only see it at Disneyland. There was really nothing else like that where someone spent that much money. Apparently, it was the most money for the running time ever spent on any film ever for the time. I just remember being just really impacted by him. I remember staying up late at night with with my best friend Tony when I was a kid, playing Moonwalker, the Genesis game. You know, where Michael Jackson throws magic. He kills enemies by making them dance with him. He saves children from cages. It was a really fun game. I remember even Sega Genesis became packaged with it. When you would buy it at the store, it was like a bundled together, Michael Jackson Moonwalker with the Sega system. So, I mean, it was like ingrained in my childhood memories. And I remember even when I don't remember if I was aware of the first civil trial happening, but I remember by the time the second one came around, I remember watching that Martin Bashir documentary, being very disturbed, but also still having, I guess I would describe now as like a cognitive dissonance about it. Like, I wasn't sure if Michael Jackson had abused the boys. I wasn't sure if Michael Jackson was just, maybe this mentally ill, really out of touch guy who didn't understand why this looked so bad, who was actually just innocent, or if he was a pedophile. I think I probably lean more towards the former at the time. Like, that's how accepting, I guess, I was of this indoctrination or this narrative that we essentially were fed. And I remember when he died feeling very, very sad. It was like the day before my honeymoon. And we listened to Michael Jackson like in Hawaii on our honeymoon the whole time. And I remember like feeling really emotional about it, and just how, what happened to him? Like, why was he so depressed? Why did he get so hooked on drugs? Like, just the tragedy of this star who was so powerful, who had fallen so far. And I remember thinking, he did seem like this kind soul who was something was wrong with him. He had a really bad upbringing. His father abused him. So I remember like not really ever believing he was like a monster or a predator. And it wasn't until I saw the Louis Theroux documentary, and I was just randomly watching all of Louis Theroux's documentaries and came across his Michael Jackson one. And it wasn't until that one that I actually believed that Michael Jackson's sexual preference was for young boys. And even at that time, when I watched that documentary, I still wasn't convinced that the actual allegations that came out about him were true, but I thought that there was the truth lies somewhere in between. Like he might have been into teenage boys, but it was maybe consensual. Like it wasn't necessarily like a predator would abuse people. I didn't really know what to think, but I still was able to listen to his music. I still was able to feel sad about what happened to him, the way his life ended so tragically. And I never really thought too much about these potential victims of his. So I guess I feel really sad about that in a way that I bought into even after I saw this Louis Theroux documentary. It was convinced that he tried to get like a 13-year-old boy to masturbate on the phone with him. I was still convinced that, he probably wasn't as big of a monster as the other narrative was saying he was. So I don't know. I mean, so watching Leaving Neverland, do you want me to describe my experience watching Leaving Neverland, or do you want to go into yours?
You forgot a really important part, Robbie, is that you did a mashup of Michael Jackson's songs with Sonic the Hedgehog even.
Oh, yeah. I was still, and this was actually right before he died, I was working on, doing mashups of, he was supposed to make the music for Sonic the Hedgehog 3 for the Sega Genesis. And the project ended up falling through, but one of his songwriters at the time had already given permission to the Japanese team working on Sonic 3 to use some of those unused compositions. Now, what's bizarre is Michael Jackson, I think he was kind of a plagiarist. Some of those melodies from those songs actually made it into other Michael Jackson songs, like just randomly, that weren't written by this guy. So that's a weird thing in and of itself. But anyways, Michael Jackson's acapellas from various songs of his with songs from Sonic 3, and they match up perfectly. That's how much of a fan I still was of Michael Jackson, like in, I don't know, 2010, 2011.
And before you get into what you experienced watching Leaving Neverland, I just wanted to, my story is a lot more brief, so I'll just get that out of the way. I always knew, of course, about the allegations. I knew that he had settled out of court. I knew that he was found not guilty at a trial, right? And so I guess I was able to completely shelve my feelings or perhaps question of whether or not there was guilt behind any of that. I was able to separate those and the possibility that he was guilty from my appreciation from his music. But again, I always felt sorry for him too. I looked at him as kind of a mirror. He kind of was a reflection of how fucked up our own society was. Like, he seemed like a product of what we forced him to be. Not we, the collective we. Like, how awful, American society is, and this material obsession and cultural depravity and stuff. Like, Michael Jackson seemed like this product of everything that was bad, and that he was this poor soul who was a victim himself.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting. I mean, even 6 months ago, Robbie, I went with Mom to the Broad, this art museum in Los Angeles, and I remember posting a photo of Michael Jackson and Bubbles, this really cool statue that someone painted of him in the museum. And I didn't give it a second thought that, but Michael Jackson has all these sexual assault allegations against him. No, it was completely separate for me. And I think that because he died so young, it halted all of that. And it made him kind of this living God, and people completely pocketed that aspect of him, and let's just look at him as a legend, and you're stomping on a dead man's grave if you ever talk about anything other than his musical genius.
I think that speaks to some cognitive dissonance, as well, for you. And I think for most people even. I think most people, even after that second, the second accusations in the actual criminal trial came out, still didn't think of Michael Jackson as a serial pedophile. Like as the primary thing you think about him, or always associated with your thoughts about him or his music. And I'm assuming you didn't either, is kind of what you're saying.
No, right.
So, and maybe there were always some people who thought that, after the Bashir documentary especially came out, which we'll talk about what came out in that. I mean, I didn't really hear anything about Leaving Neverland. I vaguely heard that there was a documentary coming out about allegations against Michael Jackson, molestation allegations. I randomly caught it on TV. It was already 20 minutes, 30 minutes into part 1.
Oh, wow.
So I missed some context for it, but the documentary actually did such a good job of slowly building you up to what eventually happens that I got enough of the context about it, about Wade Robson. But I remember for the first 10 minutes, I was experiencing some kind of disbelief, like processing confusion and thinking, this is so over the top. Not that I thought that they were lying, but I was just having a hard time understanding what I was seeing. Right. These two men were so casually talking in graphic detail about the way Michael Jackson had sexually abused them, that it was just a really jarring experience for me. And I was maybe kind of a little bit joking about it at first, like almost like as a coping mechanism with Lori. And then like 5 minutes after kind of joking and laughing or sort of trying to process what I was seeing, it was like dead silence. Like I was completely immersed in their story they were telling. Within maybe 20 minutes of watching it, I was like, oh my God, this is all true. And it's so much worse than I previously thought. It was like a paradigm shift almost.
It really is. That's a perfect way to explain it. And the consequences and the implications of their testimony, because this goes so far beyond Michael Jackson, which we'll talk about. But I think that's why it was such a paradigm shift to me too, because you realize what we were all groomed for accepting something that was so obvious, and also like the fact that we don't talk about these things, and because of the toxic masculinity, like kind of defining the patriarchy, we don't give men the room to explore abuse as much. And there is this kind of deep level of shame that hangs around men that I think is really unfortunate, because that needs to be part of the conversation is how rampant this is.
Well, I was just going to say, just to comment on what you just said, you also have to imagine back in the 80s and especially early 90s, coming out as a man saying you were sexually abused by an older man is basically, there is a sort of a sexual confusion there, especially if part of you enjoyed it when you were a child. Right. And you're still processing that. A lot of people will think, does that make me gay?
Right.
Does that mean I'm sexually confused? Does that mean I've been lying to my wife about my sexual orientation? There's a lot of shit that comes up, so that it's like much more difficult to, for that reason. And then also, it's uncomfortable to talk about this, but for young girls being sexually abused, it's commonly more painful. Young girls being abused by, adults don't usually receive a pleasurable sexual response as easily as young boys do. So it's often more confusing for young boys to go through that process.
That's really interesting.
It's more common for a young boy to have a pleasurable sexual response to getting, their penis touched, for example, by like an adult. And I think that adds to the confusion. And what really struck me, what the part that really blew me away the most about this documentary is not just the fact that Wade Robson and the other victim, James Safechuck, said that what happened to them didn't feel like abuse at the time, and that it wasn't abrasive, it wasn't forceful. That was surprising enough to hear such candid admissions about the way they felt about that. But the way that they detailed feeling like they were in love with Michael Jackson and that someday they were going to be together with him, and that they felt like Michael Jackson loved them back. Up until their adulthood, they still felt these feelings.
And they still are grappling with the fact that they do love him still, and that they actually feel like they're doing something wrong now by talking about it. They still grapple with that contradiction.
Yeah, James Safechuck, the older victim, says that he felt a pang of guilt when the movie came out, thinking that he had tarnished or just wronged Michael. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it is a part of sexual abuse that that society, I don't think, really understands and should be really educated about. You know, to understand why people suppress these things for so long. And I like that Wade Robson said very early on, even before this movie came out, when he first went to, I think it was on the Today Show with Matt Lauer, who is also a sexual predator, by the way, who's been outed. He said, this is not a case of repressed memory.
Right.
This is something much more complicated than that. I've always remembered what Michael did to me. Right. It's just only recently have I been able to come to terms with that it was very wrong. Like, he didn't even realize that it negatively impacted him until his early 30s or something. You know, that's...
Well, let me get this out of the way before we get more into this. Let me just
there's so much ground to
what the
cover.
documentary is. I mean, the documentary is absolutely imperative. It is a must-watch documentary for every single person, not because it blows the lid off the Michael Jackson case finally, but because it gives you such an important insight on grooming, on pedophilia, on child molestation, and how these things work. And how they affect society and how they destroy families and lives. And I mean, it revolves around the grueling, heartfelt testimony of two men, Wade Robson, as my brother's talking about, who's 36 years old, and James Safechuck, who's 41, and their extended families. So their immediate and extended families. You know, you mentioned that they kind of had casual reliving of these experiences. I got that from Wade, who seemed to retell things in a more clinical sense because I think he's slightly more detached.
Yeah.
James, I didn't get that from. I felt like he was suffering the entire time he was speaking. His facial expressions, his body language. I mean, it was so intense to watch him because you know that everything he says is fucking true. Like, you can't act like that. You cannot fucking act like that. And really quickly, the boys met Michael Jackson when they were very young, mid-'80s. Robson won a dance competition and went on to have this very high-profile career as this choreographer. And Jackson preyed on him when he won this dance competition as a Michael Jackson impersonator in Australia. And Safechuck, on the other hand, was cast in a Pepsi commercial opposite Jackson. And Jackson befriended them both, soon started inviting them over for sleepovers. And, you know, the sexual abuse started when Robson was just 7 years old, lasted until he was 14, and Safechuck was 10. So just to give people who haven't watched the documentary yet, just like what exactly we're talking about here. Yeah.
And I mean, I feel like it's important to lay a little bit of like the chronology of how, just in Wade Robson's example, because they didn't give as much of a specific timeline about when James Safechuck was starting to be abused as they did for Wade.
Right.
So one of the most fascinating parts that came out of this documentary, as well as, you know, and I think in a way, Michael Jackson being, you know, the case against Michael Jackson as being a serial pedophile is ranked maybe number 3 or 4 on the most interesting revelations to come out of this documentary. Just on its face. But to me, there's more interesting things, like the specific way in which Jackson groomed and sort of manipulated entire families in order to get them to let their children sleep with him and stay with him by the child's self. Like how he was able to get so many different families to agree to this. That to me was something that just gave me so much insight into how this might even be done. Everybody talks about this pedophile Hollywood conspiracy, and you know, there's all this stuff that sort of poisoned the well of, you know, that, you know, now like with Pizzagate and stuff. But to me, this sort of gave an insight into how this might be done in general, like that parents are actually often the ones who in essence, traffic their own children to Hollywood agents, agencies, film directors, whoever, talent agents, like, I don't know. But it seems like Michael Jackson already knew about this technique and was aware of it and took it to its ultimate conclusion, did it to a fucking, with an expertise unseen before. I mean, expert level manipulator. And that's a side of Michael Jackson that I didn't even know about. I mean, I was completely unaware of his level of manipulation. Like, I know he did fucked up weird things, like bought the Beatles catalog after Paul McCartney, talked about that he wanted to buy some of it for himself or something, and then he turned and betrayed Paul McCartney. I mean, I heard about weird shit like that he did that made him seem just really unethical and out of touch. But I didn't realize like how expert of a manipulator that he was, and how he was able to convince entire families to let their guard down like that. And to make the families feel like they had a special relationship with him as well. Random families, like, that never seemed to question why he would just be obsessed with their family. They never thought, well, he's just trying to do this to get to my kid. It's just absolutely mind-blowing.
At the same time, he's claiming that, the rich and elite and powers that be were out to get him. He pretended like the media was conspiring against him to make himself cultivate that like lonely persona. He had no friends. He can't relate to anyone. That's why he loves kids so much. Kids are everything to him. Kids inspire everything he does.
Well, he literally says that all the music and dancing he does is inspired by children and for children. Yeah.
Which is weird because there's so many sexualized things that he did. I mean, he invented the crotch grab, all these really sexualized dance moves. So that is also odd that he says that every single thing that he did was inspired by children. Like, why was everything so sexualized?
I think it was an inadvertent admission. I think that that he was so, he was so compulsive and so had convinced himself what he was doing on some level was okay, that he let a lot of things slip. And I think that, when he talks about, when Martin Bashir asked him, what do you get out of this? Why do you hang out with children? And it says that it's in children he sees the face of God.
What? But Michael, you're a 44-year-old man now. What do you get out of this? What do you get out of this?
He's 4.
Yeah, I'm 4. I love... I think what they get from me, I get from them. I've said it many times, my greatest inspiration comes from kids. Every song I write, every dance I do, all the poetry I write, is all inspired from that level of innocence, that consciousness of purity. And children have that. I see God in the face of children. And I just love being around that all the time.
And he sees their innocence, their life force. And it's almost like something like in classic literature, like a vampire, an energy vampire.
Exactly. That's what I was just going to say. He vampiristically is draining the children. And
he's actually admitting to it. Like he
admits to everything. Like literally every single interview that I've watched with him since watching this, he admits basically everything except molesting kids. Like nothing he says makes sense. He contradicts himself in every single interview, and he seems completely insane, but not just some wacko jacko guy. Like this is someone who knew exactly what he was doing, but actually thought it was okay to the extent that he's almost admitting it.
Yeah.
People have asked, why did the director leave in these horrifying graphic details of the sexual abuse? That's what I've heard a lot of critics say. These kids seem like they're lying. I've never heard abuse victims talk about abuse in such a sexual way. That doesn't hold up. But the director specifically said he wanted to show you, to leave no ambiguity whatsoever, that this is not just roughhousing or flirtation or just messing around. It was actual sex that you would have with an adult with a 7-year-old child every single night. That he took these kids on tour with him and convinced their parents to let them sleep with them for years alone behind closed doors. And again, he painted himself, as loving kids. Children were everything, but when you really go down to what he did, it was always kind of went down to one kid, one small boy. that were essentially his boyfriends that he was parading around in front of everyone's faces for years and years.
Yeah, and I think even if you really pay specific attention to what kind of sex acts are described by both of these victims, it was very strategic and very savvy on a certain level as to hide evidence. Think about specifically what he did not do. He would finish himself off, they would say. Mm-hmm. So he did never try to like anally penetrate them, except for Wade, like towards the very end of their relationship when he was 14. And then in that case, he actually got so paranoid, he made Wade destroy his underwear. He actually sent a car for him, brought Wade to the studio, and Michael Jackson interrupted his studio time to come out and tell Wade, I need you to go find your underpants and like destroy them. He was strategic enough to do things that more or less would be plausible deniability. That's another thing I think that if you really look at what he did, like he was very strategic about all this. And he was also very strategic about the way that he would groom the children, basically make the kids feel like they were in love with him before he would actually move on to the sexual abuse. So that to him and to the child, it would, in that context of staying with the most famous, childlike, person in the world, I'm in love with this person and he's making me feel good. And also Michael Jackson telling them, according to them, that God wants us to be together. This is how God wants us to show each other our love.
Society doesn't understand our relationship. We were brought together by God. This is something that, people are too ignorant to understand. And you hear him express this in several interviews where he says, you're ignorant.
Yeah.
If you don't understand why I like to sleep in bed with little boys behind locked doors, you're just ignorant.
I mean, it's absolutely incredible that when you really lay everything out, when you look at all the corroborating evidence, because I'm not going to sit here and say that Dan Reed, the filmmaker behind this, was a genius for figuring this out. This is all about these two kids' stories, Wade and James, and I think we owe it all to them for bringing this to light. The thing with Michael Jackson is that all the corroborating evidence, if you look back now after seeing this documentary, things that came out before that we didn't have other dots to connect to before, it's so obvious now that this was a full-on operation, that Leaving Neverland itself was, as Wade has actually said, it's not in the documentary actually, that Neverland itself was a massive, well-funded, elaborate child sex trafficking operation, a front for a child sex trafficking ring for Michael Jackson's personal pleasure. That's what it always was. And it's so obvious now looking back at it. And I'm not just talking about what it is or because it's a theme park or what it represents or because it's made for kids and it's like almost like a siren song for kids. Just all the specific things that went down there that we know about from before and now that we know about from Leaving Neverland. I mean, it's just so goddamn obvious.
I mean, it came from his overwhelming desire to sleep with kids. That's why he built up his brand the way he did. He had the movie theater, the game room, the Peter Pan themed house. Everything was themed around Peter Pan, the Pied Piper, leading kids away to this Neverland, to this amazing theme park where you can be a kid forever. And once you go down the rabbit hole, you realize that, everything that I thought before about his plastic surgery and this kind of victimhood that he painted himself with, it was actually, he was changing his identity physically to appear as a little child, I think. The estrogen that he took to make his voice really high, he wanted to look like Peter Pan.
Yeah,
he really wanted to look like Peter Pan.
Well, do you know about some interesting debate about that whole estrogen chemical castration thing? That was one of the things that came out really early on about him when there was allegations that he was gay. That he's not gay, that his dad made him get chemically castrated to keep his voice eternally high. So it was almost like one of the early iterations of like, he's a victim. He's not like, this is actually like he's been victimized. This is why his voice is so high. This is why he seems so effeminate. It's almost like you have to wonder, was he cultivating that? Because there's evidence, there's been evidence out that he was engaging in sexual acts with children as early as 1979. There's a history here that goes back very far. So you have to wonder how much of that whole image about him being this innocent, childlike person, even down to the way he made himself look, was designed to feed into his main hobby, which was pedophilia. Because his main thing, I don't think, was music. I think it was having sexual relationships with children. And that's part of why his music suffered so much, because like he maybe at some point was more into music than doing this, but then it tipped over in the other direction and it became all about that. All about having sex with children and sleeping with children.
2 comments on that. One is that after the first allegations went to trial, right, during this highly publicized trial where he inevitably was found not guilty, and that's not because there wasn't evidence, which we can talk about. But after that, if it was about him being an entertainer that was just opening his bed for children and this loving kind of asexual Peter Pan-like figure, at that point, his PR agency, his manager should have said, Michael, look, I get that you love kids, but you're going to be fucking framed again, right? If this is really a frame-up job about getting money from you, you cannot sleep with boys anymore. Like, period, end of story. Don't do it. It's not worth the risk, right? He did it more after that. That's how overwhelming the desire was, is that it actually went far beyond his job, his career as an entertainer. That's what he wanted to do more so than that. And I think that's actually why he ended up killing himself with drugs, because he was getting less desirable to children. It wasn't working anymore. The persona of, having all these kids from the 80s and 90s that worshipped him, that wasn't sticking anymore.
No.
He already had kind of the slew of allegations. And I think he honestly was facing the fact that he could not carry out the sex ring that he once did. And so what is life worth living? Robbie, he says many times, I just want to read you a couple quotes. He says, if it weren't for children, I would choose death.
Wow.
If it weren't for children, I would choose death. And he said, getting old is the ugliest, most disgusting thing in the world.
He has actually mentioned death multiple times when talking about, when the idea of his love for children comes up. It's interesting. So another time during the Martin Bashir interview, and I think he even says it again in the Ed Bradley interview that followed up after the trial, where he doubles down again about sleeping with kids in the interview. He says, I would slit my wrists before hurting a child. I would slit my wrists before hurting a child.
I don't know any 45-year-old men who are not relatives of the children who share their bedroom with other children.
Well, what's wrong with sharing your bed? I didn't say I slept in the bed. Even if I did sleep in the bed, it's okay. I am not going to do anything sexual to a child. It's not where my heart is. I would slit my wrist first. I would never do anything like that. That's not Michael Jackson, I'm sorry. That's someone else.
That's just such a...
Yeah, because he doesn't think it's hurting them, Robbie.
It's just such a drastic and over-the-top hyperbolic thing to say. And then he'll also say, what's wrong with sleeping in, them sleeping in my bed? If I was Jack the Ripper, then there'd be something wrong with them sleeping in my bed. But I'm not.
The most loving thing to do is to share your bed with someone.
Yes.
As we sit here today, do you still think that it's acceptable to share your bed with children?
Of course. Of course, why not? If you're going to be a pedophile, if you're going to be Jack the Ripper, if you're going to be a murderer, it's not a good idea. That I'm not.
But the fact that he mentions Jack the Ripper is interesting too. It's like, why is he mentioning a serial killer? Why not someone who was like a child molester? Is it because to him, what he's doing, he doesn't think it's actually that wrong? And by making the contrast between like someone like a serial murderer, it makes it in his brain, it makes it seem like this is not bad and that is. Because if he mentions like another sexual predator, it's almost like too close to what he's doing. I mean, it is what he's doing.
Of course.
So it's an interesting distinction that he's making. And you have to wonder, like, why did people even let him talk to the press? His Lisa Marie Presley thing, that music video, where he's naked with her.
First explain the sham marriage and the context of the music video.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of wanted to go back, go back
because I see the timeline right here.
Yeah, the timeline of Michael Jackson's psychosexual fuckery. Yeah. Let's call it to be kind. According to most of the family members Joe Jackson was extremely physically abusive. According to Latoya, he was sexually abusive. That's not been admitted to by any of the other family members. So there is obviously a cycle of abuse, whether it's sexual or physical, happening in the Jackson 5. I mean, just look at how fucking good of performers they were. I mean, the dad was responsible for that, apparently. Just cracking the whip, literally and figuratively, molding these kids into robots. I mean, that's what the Jackson 5 was. During their touring, when the Jackson 5 was touring, when Michael Jackson, remember, was the youngest of the family, or the youngest boy in the family, it was here that Michael witnessed his older brothers fucking groupies when Michael Jackson was like 10 years old, 11 years old. His brothers were kind of predatory also. I mean, not kind of predatory. They were apparently spying on naked women. They would drill peepholes into dressing rooms at clubs and nightclubs that they would perform at just so they could like look at the women changing in the other room. And Michael would, they would let Michael join in on that as well. And then another weird factoid that I found out is apparently Jackson 5 would play in these like raunchy nightclubs sometimes, like to get money on the side when they would already do enough of their like regular gigs. And part of that act in the raunchier clubs they would perform at would be sending like the 11-year-old Michael Jackson into the audience to like sneak under women's skirts. And it would be like part of the stage show. And people in the audience would laugh about it or something. That's just a weird thing I'd never heard about before. So this is apparently all true. And there's also some weird history with Michael Jackson and other child actors and actresses. In the mid-70s, a story came out that 17-year-old Michael Jackson was in a relationship with 12-year-old actress Tatum O'Neal. Jackson has later claimed that she tried to seduce him when she was only 12 years old. It's sort of a weird story to tell to the press that a 12-year-old tried to seduce you. It kind of actually goes along the lines of a NAMBLA mentality, that children have their own sexual agency and the child came on to me. But O'Neal is actually the one who claims Jackson tried to have sex with her when she was 12 years old, but she refused. Just another strange relationship in his history. And of course, in the Louis Theroux documentary, Terry George, the Scottish fan who went to see Michael Jackson performing in the late 70s, who interviewed him, was immediately given Michael Jackson's personal phone number. I think Terry George was only 13 years old at the time. Terry George and Michael Jackson started a phone relationship in 1979. Michael Jackson, at that time, I think Michael Jackson was like 22, tried to get this 13-year-old boy, Scottish boy, in Scotland to masturbate with him over the phone.
He spoke about masturbation, about him masturbating. Did I masturbate? I never saw it coming. It wasn't something I expected. It just came out of the blue, really. He said, would you believe that I'm doing it now? And let me hear him on the telephone. I could hear it.
And what did you think he meant by that?
Well, I knew what he meant by that because he was talking about it. He was talking about masturbation. I did feel uncomfortable. I can remember feeling uncomfortable. I felt awkward.
What are your thoughts when you put the phone down?
I thought that I didn't react as he wanted me to react. And I thought that perhaps he would never call me again, or I wouldn't hear from him again. In hindsight, looking back at it now, I know that type of conversation probably should never have happened, and it probably wasn't natural.
Terry George says there were no more sexual conversations. In time, the two lost touch.
And Terry George never said anything bad happened to him. Even when Louis Theroux brought it up in the documentary, he seemed like he was upset that he was even being asked about it because he didn't think it was a big deal. He wished the press focused more on the other wonderful conversations he had with Michael, that he misses talking to Michael. So that was interesting because it's a kind of corroborating evidence that Wade and James are telling the truth, because again, it reflects almost that he almost felt like he was in love with Michael, the loyalty that he still feels towards him.
This is really important. This is a very important point, is that he's not even an accuser because like you said,
it
he
leaked from a
and
friend of his.
Right. So he told a friend that Michael Jackson had masturbated on the phone to him and wanted him to participate or whatever. What was he, 13 or something when it happened?
1979 too.
Right. And he was very upset when Louis Theroux brought it up. He said, focus on the rest of the conversations that I had with him. And I think he almost agreed to do the documentary with Louis Theroux because he wanted Michael to see that he still wanted him to come back. He was saying, I really wish that if Michael Jackson saw this, he would, I really want him to get back in touch with me. I want to pick up where we left off. Let's continue our friendship. That is the mentality, again, like you said, of Wade and James that they were struggling with for so long. They didn't see it as abuse. He clearly loved Michael Jackson, and he never accused him of anything bad, And so that George? Right there, it's like, like the fact that Terry George didn't actually accuse him of anything, yet he is admitting that this happened, but not claiming that it's abuse, speaks volumes about the allegations, I think.
Yeah, and then of course Louis Theroux, I think actually one of the smartest questions asked. It's kind of actually early Louis Theroux, so he does ask some kind of over the top questions like about Michael Jackson's nose and shit, where I'm just like, dude, like you completely blew that. But he asked Terry George if like a 30 or a 20-year-old celebrity wanted to masturbate with your child on the phone, would that seem appropriate to you? And he's just like, no, it wouldn't be. He has to acknowledge that. It's just like, would you let your child sleep with a, 30-year-old Michael Jackson? No, of course not. But I don't think he did it. It's this weird disconnect. It's like when you ask the question that way, of course it's not appropriate. But yet he's not bothered by it still to this day into his adulthood. It is absolutely fascinating.
Well, that's the one thing that Dan Reed says, the director. He says, the most extraordinary thing in all of this is that no one denies that Jackson took little boys to his bed night after night for many, many years. What did his family and business associates think he was doing with these little boys behind a locked door? Did they actually believe he was a child in the body of a man and therefore somehow needed to sleep with little boys? Yeah. It makes absolutely no sense when you think about it for more than a second. But like you're saying, somehow that was him. He was like an aberration. He was an alien. It was like, yeah, of course it makes no sense if you apply it in any practical reality to any other person or family structure. But because it was Michael Jackson, because he was this god among men, he somehow convinced everyone that he was this asexual being that really was a child in a man's body. Yet at the same time, he had sexual urges, clearly, that were with young, prepubescent boys.
And he's telling almost the whole truth. The grooming strategy, the image he projected, which is a grooming strategy, dialed in about trying to say how much he loved children, trying to make families seem like there's a reason why he's inviting them there because he loves children so much. It's already known in society that he loves children. One of the other indisputable things, other than the fact that he let kids sleep in his bed night after night after night, and that he would so brazenly, he's basically admitting the truth when he says he loves children. He's just not saying that he's also sexually attracted to them.
Right.
To him, he does love children. The other indisputable fact, and this is something that Corey Feldman's actually said in why he thinks Michael Jackson harmed children, which is interesting, that he's admitted, even a long time ago, that he does think Michael Jackson was harmful to children. He just doesn't think they were physically abused. And here's what he said. This is from Wikipedia, actually, so I don't know how much of this I'm quoting from Wikipedia. Feldman admitted Jackson helped many children by becoming a friend and mentor, but Feldman said Jackson did more harm than good by dropping kids when he grew bored with them. The actor said, he did real damage in my overall life. I was a 12-year-old boy who was hurt by his family and ignored by people at school. Michael would sit and talk to me for hours and then he would listen. Then he would get bored. The biggest thing that Michael Jackson's done to children is befriending the ones that are in need and then abandoning them.
That was his MO too.
That's what I think. That's other indisputable evidence, is that he would befriend children, be seen with them traveling all over the world in some cases, and then switch to a new child after like a year and a half and then drop that, the previous child. What was that about? Did he only love children of a certain age?
And also, how weird was it that when he had his own kids, which is such a bizarre, different situation, which is, he had surrogates, none of the kids were really his, allegedly. But yeah, when he had them, he shrouded them from the world. You see in this Martin Bashir documentary, he's trying to feed Blanket a bottle, and it's insane. He's like yelling, he's like, I love you, Blanket, and he's like shaking and the baby's screaming, crying. It's like he's never fed a baby before, and he boasts to Martin Bashir that they don't have mothers, they don't need mothers, and that he has taken the place of both mother and father, and why should they need anyone else? And clearly, you know, if he loves kids so much, he's touring around the world with like what ended up obviously being his boyfriends at the time, but he claimed were just his friends. Why is it that he hid his own children from the public view? So he was juggling these two perceptions where on one hand, he hated the media, he hated the spotlight, but on the other hand, he did proudly parade these boyfriends around, these young prepubescent teens around the world, and put them in the limelight, put them in commercials, take photos of them, put them on the stage with him. But when it came to his own children, he didn't want them to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's so bizarre because it almost seems like the reason he even had children in the first place was to throw people off of the trail of the fact that he was a serial predator. I mean, it seems like everything he did. I mean, even as going back as far as the early 80s, I mean, just going back to the timeline really quickly, he went on a date with Brooke Shields. Apparently, even they were in a relationship when she was only 15 years old and he was of age, which is just another bizarre thing. That even like the beard relationships were like inappropriately young. But most people remember one of the first big like heterosexual stunts Michael Jackson doing was bringing Brooke Shields to the Grammy as his date. But what most people don't remember is that at the same time he did that, he was carrying Webster from the TV show Webster, aka Emmanuel Lewis, in one arm. Like he was carrying a child actor. And when Emmanuel Lewis was asked in the 2000s if Michael Jackson abused him, he said, hell no. But that's another question. It's like people use that to debunk the things in Leaving Neverland, is that Macaulay Culkin and Feldman and Emmanuel Lewis all say they weren't molested. But did Michael Jackson molest all the children he spent time with?
Right. It's like the Harvey Weinstein argument. It's like, well, here's all the women I didn't rape.
If he was this strategic about everything, not, leaving like DNA evidence even when he would molest kids. I mean, that's what it seems like to me. That's me saying that myself. That's not alleged in the documentary. But if he was this strategic about everything else and built a theme park to attract children, I mean, maybe he was smart enough not to molest the really famous child stars.
Right.
Right. Even just so that later on, if he was even contacting James and Wade, as Leaving Neverland reveals, into their adulthood to coach them on what to say at these trials to defend him, that's a really strategic long-term plan. So why wouldn't he think that Macaulay Culkin and Feldman would be like good evidence for him later on in case any allegations came out? He must have known on some level all this shit was going to come out. Like, how could it not? He was doing it so rapidly.
That's how out of control it was. I mean, that's how much he had to do it,
Yeah.
And you mentioned before that Robeson talks about how he was in love with him. And I wanted to read a quote really quick to bolster that up from Robeson himself that says, "I didn't believe or understand that the sexual stuff that happened between Michael and I was abuse. I didn't feel like I was hurt by it. At that point, it was, I loved Michael. Michael loved me. This was something that happened between us. That's it. But I still had absolutely no understanding that I was affected or any feeling that I was affected negatively." And as we know, both didn't even process that it was abuse until they themselves had baby boys. And until those baby boys started to grow up with the innocence that Michael Jackson claimed drove everything he did, was to suck vampiristically the child's innocence that he was molesting and raping. That innocence shone through with their own children. And they thought, holy shit, I was this age when Michael Jackson started to groom me.
That's so key.
Of course I didn't accept this.
Yeah, it's so key. I mean, people, and I think this is also something that, comes to mind when you talk about Macaulay Culkin and Corey Feldman. Both of them do not have children of their own. And Corey Feldman has even conceded recently, after he came out and said that Wade and James are lying, they're doing this for the money. He actually came out after that and said, I can no longer defend Michael Jackson. I can't say these people are lying. All I know is that Michael Jackson didn't abuse me, but victims need to be able to speak out. I mean, he's kind of a scam artist. He tried to do a Kickstarter for a documentary where he said he was going to expose the Hollywood pedophile conspiracy for $10 million. So he's not to be trusted. But here's the thing.
But it also, people point to him as a debunking thing, and they're like, well, why won't he come out and say it? If he was molested by other people in Hollywood, why is he defending Michael Jackson? And I've heard that as like a source of debunking. Yeah.
Michael Jackson took his time with these kids. He took his time and groomed these kids over, in some cases, like months. There's an evidence. I don't even think in the trial for I want to say the second victim, the cancer victim, he didn't attempt to molest the kid until maybe like a couple of months or something. I could be wrong on that, but he was very strategic about this. So, and I hate to be graphic myself, but if he really did have this compulsion, which it obviously seems like he did, it's very obvious in retrospect. And he even told Wade the first time he performed oral sex on him was when he was asleep. So
yeah, that's a really disturbing
So
part.
let's just explore that a little bit. Corey Feldman, Macaulay Culkin are sleeping in Michael Jackson's room. You know, they eat all this candy, drinking all this soda, they pass out. Later on, Michael Jackson apparently started plying his victims with alcohol. Seems like that's when he was going on the decline. His fame was not as big. His looks were going away. So he maybe needed to do that. But originally, maybe the candy and the ice cream and running around at the theme park was enough to get these kids passed out enough. Or even if they don't remember being molested, how do you know you weren't if you were sleeping in his bedroom? So you would never really know. That should have at least sunk in a little bit for Feldman and Culkin already.
Right.
But I think, I mean, and also, this is gross to talk about, but the likelihood that Michael Jackson was just like erect the whole time he was always hanging out with kids is pretty high. And that he was basically just like edging himself the whole time. Even if he didn't even get to make sexual contact with the kid, like the first night they slept over, you're telling me that he didn't like go into the bathroom and fantasize about what he was going to do with the, I mean, the whole thing revolved around his desire to have sex with children.
Even Wade says, I have a hard time believing there's not many more victims because I have a hard time believing he kept little boys around him for the sake of anything other than abusing them.
Even
sexually.
if he didn't touch them, he was still sexualizing them in his mind. He was still getting turned on by being around them. So Macaulay Culkin, you know, has sworn up and down he wasn't touched. He's even laughed it off on the Larry King show, saying, you know, most people don't realize Michael Jackson's bedroom's like 2 stories. There's like a separate entrance and like a ladder like going into the back, and it's like a guest room. I mean, when you're sleeping in Michael Jackson's room, it's got like its own bathroom. You have like 2 bathrooms.
What did happen? Nothing happened, you know. I mean, nothing really. I mean, we played video games, you know. We played it as an amusement park. Well, the thing is with that whole thing is that, you know, they go, oh, you slept in the same bedroom as him. It's like, I don't think you understand. Michael Jackson's bedroom is 2 stories. And it has like 3 bathrooms and this and that. So when I slept in his bedroom, yeah, but you have to understand the whole scenario. And the thing is with Michael is that he's not very good at explaining himself, and he never really has been, because he's not a very social person.
Very just like defensive about it, but there is a witness who was bringing food to the arcade while Macaulay Culkin was sleeping there, who witnessed Michael Jackson putting his hands down Macaulay Culkin's pants while they were playing an arcade game together. So that's that. I think that actually made it into like sworn deposition. Macaulay Culkin, of course, denies that though, and he testified in Michael Jackson's defense, just like Wade Robeson did. Maybe he wasn't touched by Michael Jackson. Maybe he doesn't remember being touched. But for him to be so naive and ignorant, I mean, at some point he has to admit to himself that Michael Jackson was fully sexualizing me. And I was like his little prize, like sex toy. Even if I don't remember him touching me. The
whole debunking thread of this documentary, which really is a house of cards. It's completely based on nothing. But Robeson defended Michael Jackson during the 2004 trial, in which he was charged with sexually abusing then 13-year-old Gavin Arvizo. Robeson also testified in Jackson's defense in 1993 when he was 22 years old. So, of course, people are like, that's insane. Why would he ever do that? Obviously, if you understand what we're talking about and what he explained himself, which is, I did not think of it as abuse. And again, the coaching and grooming for almost 2 decades from Michael Jackson telling him, like, I will go to jail, you will go to jail for the rest of our lives. You will, I will be ruined. And the guilt that went along with thinking that you could actually bring down who you felt was a god and this figure that you loved, of course you're not going to do that. I mean, I was even impressed that James didn't testify and felt like he couldn't do it again.
Not to disparage him in any way, but I mean, he still was complicit in the sense that he didn't say anything.
I know.
He just remained silent, you know.
And poor Gavin, this guy was a cancer victim. That's what's so disgusting is Michael Jackson made himself seem like a Make-A-Wish Foundation in one person. It was like, I can grant children's dreams and come to Neverland Ranch. And so this kid who was a cancer patient was one of the kids that came out and was found, you know, who wasn't awarded anything because Michael Jackson was found not guilty. And this kid probably has a really tough life now. After not getting any support from people who actually knew he was telling the truth at that time. It sucks. I mean, they have regrets about it too. They say, I wish that I was ready. Like, I regret so much not getting his back. Like, I was him, you know, and I didn't stand up for him. And in fact, I helped Michael Jackson get off. I mean, that must be a really awful thing to live with.
Yeah, because how many other victims were there? How many other victims are there who still don't even feel like they were abused and who are, you know, might not even have come to terms with it yet? If they took so long to come to terms with it, you know, it's just insane to think how long he was doing this, how it was his main thing, much more than music was. And another whole other side to it too is just how many people protected him and enabled him.
I mean, the most fascinating part of the Martin Bashir documentary, you need to watch this too, to really understand who Michael Jackson was, because Leaving Neverland doesn't really give you an insight. You know, he's only talking when he has that video that he releases to deny the allegations, and it's creepy. But this really gives you an insight on like who the hell really was Michael Jackson as a person. And even though he's, you know, this black icon and painted as one of the world's greatest entertainers and artists, he can't even explain why he likes music, why he does what he does. Every time he's asked about why he has this strange relationship with kids, like, I mean, I could give a better explanation. It's like, yeah, kids inspire me. Like, these are the future leaders. Like, he couldn't say any of that. He's just like rambling about how children are God and their innocence is wonderful and how if children didn't exist, he would kill himself. But like, he doesn't ever explain why children actually inspire him or inspire his music. It's all just very creepy, mealy-mouthed things that actually just make him look culpable and guilty as fuck every single time he opens his mouth. Like even Martin Bashir, I mean, he's holding hands so tightly. Someone makes the point, like, do you ever see Michael Jackson being intimate with women? No. It's only just holding kids so close, right up against them, holding their hand, hugging them, embracing them. And he's with this kid that eventually accused him, Gavin, and he's holding his hand so closely next to him in this documentary. And Martin Bashir is just like, what is the sleeping situation?
They've stayed in your bedroom?
Well, very few.
But, you know, some have. And they say, is that really appropriate for a man, a grown man, to be doing that? How do you respond to that?
I feel sorry for them because that's judging someone who wants to really help people. Why can't you share your bed? The most loving thing to do is to share your bed with someone. You know?
You really think that?
Yeah, of course.
You're taking a position that you use every single night that you go into. You sleep, and you're sharing it with another.
You say you can have my bed if you want. Sleep in it. I'll sleep on the floor. You can. It's yours. Always give the best to the company, you know? Like to him, I said, because he was going to sleep on the floor. I said, no, you sleep in the bed. I'll sleep on the floor.
But haven't you got a spare room or a spare house here where he could have stayed?
Yeah, but no. Yes, we have guest units, but whenever kids come here, they always want to stay with me. They never want to stay in the guest. And I have never invited them in my room. They always just want to stay. They say, can I stay with you tonight? I go, if it's okay with your parents, yes, you can.
And Michael Jackson contradicts himself several times, blatantly lies. He always says, you know, it's between, yes, I sleep with kids, and then like, no, I'm sleeping on the floor in a sleeping bag. Yeah, Michael Jackson really slept on the floor in a sleeping bag. Like, does anyone believe that?
Yeah.
And then you can kind of see this kid reacting real time, clearly had been coached by Michael Jackson before he expresses himself.
coached
And then you
very
realize,
well.
like, because the kid is just like, sharing your bed with someone is actually the most, you know, beautiful thing that you could do. He's like, this is a symbol of something that's really important. But then he also says, like, Michael Jackson told me if you really loved me, you would get in the bed.
On the bed, sleep on the bed. We're like, no, you sleep on the bed. And then he finally said, okay, if you love me, you sleep on the bed. I was like, oh man. And so I finally slept on the bed. But it was fun that night.
I slept on the floor. Was it sleeping bag?
No, he packed the whole vest of blankets on the floor.
Yeah, you really love me, you'll get in the bed, and then Michael Jackson's trying to present it like he meant that he was
floor.
on the
I'm on the sleeping bag.
Yeah, like that if you get in the bed, I'm going to sleep on the floor, so you can't sleep in the same place as me. But it was crazy because it was the part where he was getting the most nervous. You could tell Michael Jackson was getting the most nervous. He was almost like giggling out of nervousness, like hoping the kid was going to say the right thing. But I think the part that made him the most nervous was it revealed part of his grooming process that Michael Jackson didn't even really necessarily admit in public, that he would hold over a child's head the idea of loving them. Like, if you love me, like even saying that in a teasing way, like parents, like you're not supposed to do that as a parent. You're not supposed to act like anything like that. You know, like that's bad. That's problematic language to use to deal with children. And it's like, if he's using that language regularly to talk to children, it's all part of his grooming process, his manipulation process. So I think that was a revealing moment too, just for that. He doesn't want people to know that he talks to kids that way. He just wants people to know that he loves these kids and he sees the face of God in them. Apparently he thinks that that'll fly.
Michael Jackson was also a pathological liar. So for all of these naysayers, and there really is a kind of a cult of Michael Jackson defenders from this, even though the evidence is overwhelming, they'll say, oh, these kids are lying. The kids want money. So yeah, of course you can point to the fact that Wade did sue like the state for a ridiculous amount of money, $1.5 billion in 2013, like completely absurd. However, the statute of limitations for child abuse and for what he was trying to sue for had expired. So maybe it was a symbolic number. As we know, they would have to win a hotly contested court battle to even see a dime.
Yeah.
So I don't see how money is actually the deciding factor for them coming out and telling their stories as victims. But people will say, oh, they're lying. What about Michael Jackson? He is the most pathological liar I've ever seen. I mean, look at these interviews with him. You know, he says that he's never gotten plastic surgery, and that's insane, right?
Yeah.
And then he's telling Martin Bashir is just like, Blanket's mother is white, right? Because Blanket was just born, and he says no. He says his mother was black, and he's like, but she's so white, like. And Michael Jackson is like, that's why they call us colored people, because we're all different colors.
Would you have conceived a child with a black woman?
Of course.
As a surrogate mother?
Of course.
But I've seen Blanket, and I think safe to say his mother was probably white.
No, you're wrong.
I'm wrong?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So Blanket's mother's black?
Yeah.
But Blanket's so light.
Black people were called colored people because we come in all colors. From very white, as white as my hand, to very dark, as the dark of your shirt.
He did something strategic also when he went on Oprah, I think in the very early 90s, and said some half-truths to Oprah. He said he only got like 2 surgeries in his whole life, plastic surgeries, because of the Pepsi commercial fire. So there's like some weird thing about Pepsi commercials in him, some darkness there. I don't know do you know about that he got like burned in a Pepsi commercial?
What the fuck?
You don't know about this?
No.
It kind of like was a way for him to reinvent his whole image. After all the things started piling up against him, he went on Oprah and brought people back to this time where he actually caught on fire during the filming of a Pepsi commercial. There's video of it you can see online. And it actually did burn him pretty badly. He claims the reason he started getting surgeries is because of the burns, and he needed to get reconstructive surgery, and it like ruined his scalp. And then he also said that the reason why his skin looks the way it does is because he has vitiligo, which is like a skin condition that's like common among like African Americans, where you have discolorations where parts of your skin have very light discolorations.
When Michael Jackson was a boy, he was a black kid. And now as an adult, he looks like a white man.
Well, you gotta ask God that. That has nothing to do with me, okay? And that's ignorance.
What do you mean it's got nothing to do with you?
I don't control, puberty. I don't control the fact that I have vitiligo. I don't control,
And that somehow reinvented his image enough where like people kind of started to feel sorry for him again. And we're like, maybe he's not really lying about all this. Like it was weirdly worked on a lot of people. I mean, it was just, I'm just thinking back to that.
I mean, the thing is, he became not only white, but ivory.
Well, that's the thing. It's like vitiligo is random. It's like, it's splotchy. It doesn't affect you uniformly. So he obviously did something, bleach the rest of his skin. Actually, there is evidence that he does have it, which came out in the forensic evidence against him in the molestation allegations about his penis having discoloration on it. So he probably does actually have what he's talking about. It doesn't explain why he's all white. So yeah, of course he's lying about that.
That's why let's talk about that. The fact that the first victim who, got paid off, he got paid off $25 million from Michael Jackson, who claimed later that he just didn't want a big drawn out court battle like the OJ case. He just wanted to quietly pay this guy off, even though it was false, right? The problem is that the evidence against Michael Jackson was, again, overwhelming to the point that he had to pay the kid off $25 million and sign an NDA. That's why we probably haven't heard from this first kid. But because the kid perfectly described his erect penis with that disease, with the blotches, and that's only something that someone would know if they saw his erect penis. Now, people will debunk this and say, oh, the kid alleged that Michael Jackson was circumcised. When a penis is erect, it's hard to tell if a penis is circumcised. And plus the kid, again, perfectly described the blotches on Michael Jackson's erect penis. So I don't know how that keeps getting away from people who want to constantly try to debunk the overwhelming evidence that this kid did see Michael Jackson's penis. Now, one other quick comment about just, he's a black icon and that this is racially motivated. Similarly to the O.J. Simpson case, that the defense used racial motivation to get him off. That was kind of the public perception that, again, you have a famous black celebrity who's being victimized by society.
Johnny Cochran.
Yeah, and there you go. Johnny fucking Cochran.
And Mark Garagos, two OJ
What do you know,
lawyers.
dude? He didn't want to be black. He wanted to be white as fucking snow.
And again, he used that to spin shit. He made it sound like he constructed this image of himself that his dad, damaged him so much that like he didn't want to look like his dad.
But it's like the fact that people are like, oh, he had this black experience. He didn't have a black experience. I mean, he had a really crazy experience growing up as a child star, as a young black man, but he became the most famous, rich celebrity in the world.
Yeah.
How is that having a black experience? How is that going through the justice system in a racially prejudiced way? It was that he was able to like shroud himself in the notion that he was being racially persecuted, just like O.J. Simpson was, to get off part of it,
It's absolutely crazy. I mean, and the fact that he did that, I think that was even done for the civil trial, right? He didn't have Johnny Cochran for the actual criminal trial.
I'm not sure about that.
I don't think so, yeah. So it was like actually not that long after the OJ shit went down. So it was just an odd choice, just optically, to do that. But, going back to the idea that they're doing this for the money because they're suing the estate, okay, let's buy into that argument just a little bit. Even if that's true, can't both be true? That if it's not just a symbolic thing where they want to have their day in court to put this on the record and get it off their chest, like they say, and they do want money, why can't it both be true that they want money from this and they were actually abused by Michael Jackson? It's just so funny to me that people act like it has to be one or the other, too.
Oh, totally.
I would want
totally.
money if I was
Right.
molested by Michael Jackson for 7 years. You
Yeah,
know?
dude. And the fact that the Jackson estate has the most to lose here. They have been grifting off Michael Jackson's legacy, his music, his catalog for a decade now. They have made $2 billion since he's died. They are the most powerful entity by far. They have PR agencies. They have kind of black operation style sock puppet accounts that are employed to correct the record online. It goes so far because think about it. They have the most to lose to discredit these men. They are the ones with the money. They're the ones with the billions of dollars. They don't want you to know the truth because they have everything to lose.
Well, yeah, and also not just everything, not just money for them, but also just like their family legacy. I mean, but on the other hand, it's like they only really have Michael and themselves to blame because they protected and propped this up for years and years. They knew all about this operation that Michael Jackson was running, and they looked the other way. And apparently, only the mother, and Latoya. Well, the mother didn't go on record, but only the mother and Latoya apparently are the ones who like raised a stink about this behind the scenes to the rest of the family. So the rest of the family just was willfully blind. They acted like it wasn't a problem, that all he did was just hang out with little boys and have them spend the night feeding off his wealth. So they're fully complicit. Fully complicit.
Yeah, Latoya, this is insane. And of course, people are like, well, she's recanted it now. Well, they have a lot to lose again. But back in the 90s, Latoya was interviewed several times talking
during
about
the first civil trial
how she thought Michael Jackson was a pedophile. She said, quote, "Michael is my brother. I love him a great deal, but I cannot and will not be a silent collaborator of his crimes against small, innocent children. I fuel the guilt and humiliation these children are feeling if I remain silent, and I think it's very wrong. Michael needs help. This has been going on since 1981. It's not one child." She talks about the exorbitant fees that he's paid out to. She alleges several children. She said it fits into a larger pattern, and that he's bought the silence with very, very large sums. And she ends by saying, now you stop and think for 1 second, and you tell me what 35-year-old man is going to take a little boy and stay with him for 30 days straight, and take another boy and stay with him for 5 days in a room and never leave the room? How many of you out there are 35 years old? How many of you would let this happen? And then following this, she was ostracized reportedly by her parents, Michael and other siblings. And then later, after Michael died, and you see the same thing with Martin Bashir, he kind of came out in like this weird guilt complex where he was like, I feel bad about what I did with my documentary. And Latoya apparently felt bad too.
Well, you know why part of why he said that is because apparently his career like took a dive. People like ruined his career at the time. I mean, I don't know much about what happened to Bashir afterwards, but I mean, Latoya, the thing about Latoya is really interesting because a lot of people have just assumed she's like crazy or something. But if you actually listen to you listen to that quote you read and listen to the whole interview, she sounds very lucid. She drops several breadcrumbs. She actually holds back a lot. She doesn't say that Michael Jackson's a child molester. She's sort of putting the warning out there. And she also drops breadcrumbs revealing that the mother in the family was really alarmed about what she thought was going on, and that the mother thought that it just meant that Michael was gay, apparently, and that the mother had seen a lot of these checks paying off children's parents. This actually sort of ties back to corroborating evidence that didn't come out in Leaving Neverland specifically, but came out in interviews with the brothers trying to say Leaving Neverland was all bullshit. So the brothers were actually asked in an interview recently, was there anyone in your family who was trying to talk Michael Jackson out of doing these sleepovers just because of how bad it looked? And Jermaine actually I think he let slip that the mother would talk about it. Kind of goes back and corroborates what Latoya was saying.
That's interesting because in the Louis Theroux documentary, when he finally interviews Joe Jackson at the end of it, and Joe Jackson, he brings up, like, do you want to see Michael settled down with a man or a woman, with a partner? And they end the interview, essentially. I mean, he's just like, how dare you allege Michael's gay? What do you mean by partner? He even like slips and says he doesn't like boys. It seems like there's a lot of homophobia and hostility to the notion of homosexuality in general with that family. And so it was just really weird. It was like, I didn't know if it was just an anti-gay sentiment or if they actually knew of something, and that's why he slipped and said the boys thing. Did you get that?
I didn't catch the thing where it flipped and said boys, but I did find it very. First, I was like, well, they're Jehovah's Witness, and maybe they're just like really homophobic, and it's really ingrained. But the more that I thought about his response, and if the mother apparently also would say things like, Michael's a guy, apparently, to Latoya. This also came in another interview.
What kind of evidence do you have that your brother did, in fact, sexually abuse these young boys?
I want you to know that there aren't really any evidence. The only thing that I know of, and my mother has actually shown me these things, she's the one that was outraged and brought them to me, that were checks that were written to the little boy's parents. And there are 2 checks that I know of that she has shown me, and it's for a substantial amount of money. And she was outraged over it.
How much money and are you certain you know what these checks were for? Let's say that Michael...
I don't know what they were for, but I know they were written to the parents of the little boys that would sleep over.
You're just assuming then that it's hush money. Did your mother ever tell you that this money was being given to the alleged the parents of the alleged victims to keep them quiet?
That's why I can't say that it's hush money. Apparently, it was given for some reason. I don't know why, but I do know that she was outraged during that particular time. This is around 84, mind you. And she would say things like, I can't stand this. He's nothing but a fag. I can't stand this. And I would say, Mother, don't say that. Just because you see a check doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean anything.
But basically...
And that's the way she took it. Now, to this day, she denies it because she has no support. In other words, if she were to go and tell the truth, Michael would drop everything and she would probably be out on the street. So she has to stand by in that way. But the only reason I'm speaking up is because I'm an abused victim, and I don't want to see anyone else hurt like that because I know what it feels like to be hurt.
But basically, I'm sorry, Latoya, I was going to say basically because of these checks shown to you by your mother and the fact that Michael, do you know for sure that he spent 30 nights with this alleged victim?
I do know that he would have boys over all the time. One, of course, and they would stay in the room for days. Then they would come out, and then there would be another boy, and he would bring someone else, but never 2 at a time or anything like that. Let me ask you a question. What 35-year-old man do you know that sleeps with little boys and stays with them for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and sleep in the same bed? I'm asking you this question because this is a valid question. It's very open. Because most people would say, well, this is totally wrong. It's totally unfair.
Yeah, most people might...
You know, what you have to remember is that Jordy, I do not know this kid. I have never met this kid. I know nothing about him. But at the same time, I feel bad for him, and no one's caring about Jordy. Jordy is in a very bad position.
What's your reaction to what your folks had to say, Latoya?
I didn't understand the fact that he was bothering little kids. I didn't understand why the checks were written. She was the one who was trying to explain these things to me.
You claim
but
that...
now she's denying it and covering it up.
You claim that the reason your mom is siding with Michael is because...
It almost, to me, I read it as maybe they were in such denial about what was actually happening. They were so willfully blind that their brain couldn't process that he wasn't gay, that he was a pedophile who only was sexually attracted to young boys.
Right.
So to them, the egregious thing would be that if he was gay.
Right.
Even the idea that just getting a wife and kids would fix his image is an odd strategy because that was never, especially in the 90s, people stopped thinking that he might be gay to he might be a child molester or a pedophile. What did Latoya mean by this has been happening since 1981?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really does raise the question of how many other victims there are out there. I mean, it seems like he really always, if the Terry George thing is to be believed, that happened in 1979, and there's no reason to doubt it. Based on all the circumstances and the context of it, it seems totally legit. So when did this all start for him? I mean,
Well, and it's also weird that he had sham marriages. It's like if he was this asexual being that didn't have sexuality and he couldn't relate to anyone, why feel the need to have several sham marriages?
Well, it shows that there was
Lisa
a narrative.
Marie Presley.
There was a
Right.
narrative that was being cultivated, and it was shifting based on what needed to be put up there to defend his behavior at the time.
Right, and it was just so obvious. It's like compare Michael Jackson's interactions with the young children that he was parading around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Compare that to Lisa Marie Presley, the most awkward, cringeworthy photo op / video that they did to pretend that they were actually having sex. And it's just bizarre, like completely bizarre. Of course, you had the maid and stuff corroborating that Lisa Marie never even spent the night. Their marriage, I think, barely lasted a year. The maid claims, and she did this really amazing 60 Minutes interview recently that we could put on the timeline as well, but she talks about just really horrifying details that aren't outlined in Leaving Neverland. But she says that she thinks that Michael Jackson just wanted access to Elvis's back catalog, just like he bought the Beatles catalog. And
that's why
she says that there's
that he chose her.
Yeah.
Well,
and she thinks that Lisa really liked him, but he just had no sexual feelings toward her at all.
I mean, there's an interesting connection to the cycle of abuse there too, because Lisa Marie Presley is the daughter of Priscilla and Elvis Presley, and Priscilla and Elvis Presley first met each other when she was 14, and that's when they fell in love. Maybe not as egregious as molesting and raping young boys when you're a grown man, but still odd that that it was actually even more normalized back then, where like a grown man could get together.
Totally.
And apparently he used to feed her amphetamines and sleeping pills while she was like going to high school, and have like a car drive her to high school and pick her and drive her back home. So
wow.
I'm not saying Elvis was technically a pedophile or anything like that. It's just interesting how, some of the biggest stars in this century or the previous century were sexual predators.
And had normalized and conditioned society to think that this was okay, and they were put on a pedestal to make it okay because their fame superseded their crimes. And Michael Jackson told James and Wade that he was going to have a series of relationships with women in the public eye. And he said those are not going to mean anything to him, that he hates women. He actually hated women. This is a current that you see also in their testimony and a lot of other witnesses, that he actually detested women. He said women were evil. And so, that just goes along with how much he didn't, it was all fake, to the point where it must have been really painful for him to even pretend like he was sexual with women.
It's hard to say if he ever actually had sex with any women. It's just so weird. And it's so obvious. I mean, even if the kids didn't reveal that, it's so obvious that that's what he was doing. I mean, I remember people commenting at the time of how fake everything seemed, especially that music video with them.
Yeah, I mean, looking back on it, it's like, all of these things kind of seem like symbolism and like allegories now, like the, Thriller, him turning into a monster, the bad thing.
Smooth Criminal.
Like that Smooth Criminal. I mean, all of these things just seem so bizarre looking back on it.
Well, they're like almost like cartoonishly allegorical if all of this shit's true. And it seems so obvious that it is true. You almost have to think, wow, this is all strategic, or a reflection of his desire to have sexual children.
Even in Moonwalker, the jukebox that he's dancing in the middle of, doing the crotch grabbing, Peter Pan, the Pied Piper, is lining the jukebox, which means that there's obviously like hidden symbolism that he directed artistically to groom children.
Wait, in the movie Moonwalker?
Yeah.
Wait, tell me again, because I don't remember the scene. We've watched that movie dozens. See, that was, I think, our bonding moment over Michael Jackson.
Oh, incredible movie. The claymation and stuff. It was a really one of its kind. But yeah, there's a scene in it that it's zooming into a jukebox of him dancing, and there's the Peter Pan Pied Piper all lining the jukebox. And that is really interesting. And I hope more people find more kind of hidden symbols that he put to groom kids because, and as we know, even The Simpsons had to pull an episode that Michael Jackson guest hosted because he used the entire episode, they allege, as a grooming mechanism. In the episode, Michael Jackson befriends Lisa and Bart and, you know, does what he does best, which is befriending little kids. And they said they actually, are, looking back on it, they're like, he used us to groom more boys.
Yeah.
And he probably showed kids that episode, you know, when he had them over for sleepovers.
I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, the video game itself shows him rescuing. It's like one of the things you're supposed to do in the game is you have to rescue all the children from each level. I mean, the movie it's based on, I was going to say, you know, I posted this thing on Facebook saying, is this sort of a uniquely American psychology that one of our most famous, beloved stars did this, and we can't, even the people who acknowledge it's fucked up that he slept with boys, you know, it's still not commonly accepted that he was a serial pedophile. We're still in mass denial about it. And I just sort of wondered out loud, is this sort of a uniquely American thing? And several people said, no, it's not American. And the more I thought about it, I guess the reason why it seems like it is part of sort of almost like the American Empire baby syndrome that we talk about so much is because Michael Jackson used the narratives from our childhood, a lot of the propaganda narratives as well, to basically make a film to really sell this image of himself as being a savior of children. So Moonwalker is a bunch of vignettes that are basically music videos and like original little vignettes connected by a larger storyline where Michael Jackson is at, I guess, Neverland Ranch at the beginning. He's like in a grass field playing with a bunch of kids, like playing tag with a bunch of children in the movie. They go to this city and a bunch of the kids get accosted by a bunch of drug dealers ran by a gang lord, Joe Pesci. So in this movie, it's kind of a very like Reagan era movie in a way. He's saving the kids from like this evil drug gang, you know, that's taking over the city and corrupting everybody and trying to give drugs to kids, which is like something that nobody really ever did, like giving drugs to literal children. It was just such a weird 80s Reagan era thing. And here he is selling the idea that he's a savior of children in this movie.
When he's like giving candy to babies, candy to kids.
Yeah, and then he's fucking morphing into a robot, like a transformer, protecting the kids. And then the video game based off of that is like super popular. It gets bundled with the Sega Genesis. I mean, this was all on some level grooming, strategic grooming. I mean, and it's really, I hate to use the word impressive, but if his goal was to assault children and to be able to get away with it in plain sight, it was an impressive level of coordination and willpower to make all this stuff come into existence. I mean, it's unbelievable, actually.
So one interesting thing about the Louis Theroux documentary was showing how rabid and fanatical his fans were and are. So if you go on social media, like I tweeted something about leaving Neverland the second that I saw it, and I was like, there's no doubt. This leaves absolutely no question that Michael Jackson was a serial pedophile or serial child molester, more accurately. And I got a lot of backlash. I would say the vast majority of people were saying, a lot of people just said blatantly, like, it's false, these kids are lying. It was pretty heated. And then I kind of realized that there is a domination on social media of Michael Jackson defenders, cultists, people who will die before they admit that Michael Jackson was a pedophile and did rape children. And that was an interesting insight from the Louis Theroux documentary, was seeing kind of an insight on who the fans are. And a lot of them, it was just really bizarre. It was like a level of stardom that I have never even seen. Even though I've seen footage of the Beatles and people screaming and stuff at them, it was like Michael Jackson could look at someone and they could just like be heaving on the ground with body sobs. I mean, it was that level of star power that he had and the presence that he had over people. And I think that it is really, really difficult for people to wrap their mind around. And I want to quote Safe Chuck himself that says, people think his music's so great, so he is great. And people grew up with him. He's been a star since he was a little kid. So to think that person is doing the worst possible things to kids, it's impossible for people to wrap their hands around. It's a really important point because it sheds light on why people are in mass denial about accepting this. It's kind of like once you accept this and you can no longer remove yourself and no longer have that cognitive dissonance, you have to open yourself up to that paradigm shift that we're talking about, that it's so much more beyond him. It's your family, it's your friends, it's your community, it's your soccer coach. You know what I mean? It's like it's something that we have to face.
Well, yeah,
but it's so difficult to face it.
And I think it's just such a unique example. It's hard to compare it to other pedophilia, like inside your family or inside your home or your church or whatever, because Michael Jackson was so dedicated to this and so good at it and ultimately so skilled in the whole operation and hiding it in plain sight and sort of almost making it seem normalized and doing it out in the open, that he got away with it. He really did. He might have been crushed internally, emotionally, by being outed and having like the public know and start talking and whispering about it, but he got away with it. He didn't go to jail. That really shows a high level of skill, a cunning criminal. Really. I mean, even just the idea of getting the parents involved in the first place and making them complicit in it almost makes it like the parents will have to out themselves if they find out any molestation is going on.
And two of the dads killed themselves.
Yeah.
Of the victims.
And I really think that was part of the strategy. He wanted to almost make it almost in his mind, well, if I do it this way, then it's like legal. It's not like I'm taking the kid and sort of like sneaking him away from his parents into my room. It's like the parents are literally letting the child sleep in my bed. So like, what are they going to tell the police anyways? Like, I almost wonder if he even had that conversation with himself a lot. Like, This is almost my buffer. Because the parents will have to go to the cops and be like, well, wait, you let your kid sleep in his bed? It's almost like an impossible story to have like report to the police.
Right. I know. And it seems interesting. Like the knee jerk reaction is to be like, well, it's the parents' fault. People are more upset with the parents than they are at Michael Jackson by being like, well,
yeah,
you know, they should have never put their kids in that situation. But like, it's so clear to hear the parents themselves describe how they were also groomed
and manipulated. Yeah. I mean, I'm not making excuses for the parents, but
no,
they definitely, there was a high level of manipulation being done on the parents. Clearly. I mean, even just the idea that Michael Jackson, I don't even know if James actually specified this. You have to tell me if you did. The part I found really interesting is Michael Jackson would come and stay at James Safechuck's house with his family.
And pretend like he had no friends, that he had to go and actually just, that's the only people that he could connect to.
And eat dinner with them, dinner that the mom would cook. And I don't know if James ever said that Michael Jackson molested him there. So
no.
So it seems like that was just
yep.
all strategic to get the family. And like the mom said, it was like a fairy tale. Michael Jackson wanted to come spend time with us.
Right.
Just little old us. Like he didn't, you know, like we weren't special. It's expert manipulation is really what it is.
And also the phone calls and faxes, like he would be on the phone with these young boys, 7, 8, 9 years old for 7 hours at a time.
Yeah.
Michael Jackson, the most famous, richest celebrity in the world, was calling these kids and talking to them for hours.
And writing letters calling them nicknames, telling them I love you in the letters. One story that I remember seeing in one of these random documentaries I was watching leading up to doing this podcast was, I think it was on the BBC, a German fan. This is like a worldwide operation for Michael Jackson. A German child fan, Michael Jackson nicknamed, and he used to send him letters saying like, I can't wait to meet you, Bubba Rub. You know, I love you, Bub Rub.
Young Michael Jacobshagen went home to Germany, but Jackson didn't forget his new friend. Jackson continued courting Michael from the other side of the world with tenderly worded notes and letters.
One of them is from Neverland. What he sent it to me. This was after 1998. He writing Michael, I truly miss you very much. Thanks for your loyalty and support. I wait for you at Neverland. All my love, always, Michael Jackson.
How many of these letters did he send you?
30, 35.
Those letters culminated in an invitation to join Jackson on a leg of his History World Tour.
When did you first spend your night on your own with Michael Jackson?
This was in 1998.
Would there be any contact between his body and your body?
Yes. I mean, we was together, our bodies was together. I was on this side and he was behind me and he put his arm around me.
Pressed up against you?
Yes.
Was there ever anything sexual that happened between you?
The bodies together, you know? The bodies, that's why he also my rubber friend, you know? I mean...
What does that mean?
Rubber is that you put your two bodies together, you know?
As in rubbing up against each other?
Yes, this is exactly what is rubber.
And he actually gifted this boy a book that was all naked pictures of young boys and autographed it Michael Jackson. In this book, Michael Jackson also circled the buttocks of a young boy, naked young boy, with an arrow drawn pointing towards it.
What sets Michael's claims apart from all the others is that he has physical proof to back up what he is saying.
There's a book called The Boy. This is a book with naked boys, completely naked boys inside. And this is what he gave it to me as a present. This was one of the pages here.
What does that say?
To Michael J., my friend, your rubber friend, MJ.
There's just so many other examples, and this German fan hasn't even really made that big of a deal about it. Like, as he's showing the reporter about it, he's not like, oh yeah, like, I got freaked out after this. He kind of insinuates that he could tell Michael Jackson was sort of testing the waters to try to see where things would go. But he doesn't ever really, like, he doesn't seem that upset about it even really. There's so much evidence out there that, and even if you don't believe he molested the kids, why was he sleeping with the kids in his bed? Why was he rotating all these kids out? Why was he manipulating these families? Why was he paying them off? Even just that's just really bizarre behavior.
Why did he want to make a children's day together with Rabbi Shmuley?
Holy shit. Rabbi Shmuley.
It's an insane story.
Yeah, became his spiritual advisor, I guess, towards the end of his life. And I heard an interesting statement by a psychotherapist who's like an expert in childhood sexual abuse recently. And someone was like, well, what do you have to say to people who are like, Michael Jackson was like the nicest person ever. He doesn't have a mean bone in his body. He was just so nice and so kind and had such a big heart. And the therapist said, well, there's a big difference between nice and kind. Kind means that you have empathy for someone. You care about someone. It reflects like values that you hold. Nice is a behavior, and it could be superficially used by predators and criminals who are very smart criminals are often very good at acting nice. It is a behavior. A lot of people, and you could even speak to this, Abby, like I think both you and I still sort of have this issue where like, it's like if someone's being really nice, it's like almost like your default response is like, well, I don't want to be mean. So if I'm like not equally nice, or I don't sort of feed in, or like match them on their niceness, then somehow I'm being mean. And predators can take advantage of that dynamic. So it's almost like Michael Jackson, you could see that characteristic playing out in the way that he interacted with children. Just from that little snippet from the Bashir documentary. Well, if you love me, you'll sleep on the bed.
If you love me, you sleep on the bed.
Yeah, that manipulation.
I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd to think that pedophiles would be mean, or that you would somehow know who's a pedophile or who's a child molester. Obviously, this many kids wouldn't be getting molested and raped by child molesters if they looked like child molesters, if they acted like child molesters. I mean, of course they don't.
Have you seen
and
Abducted?
that's precisely the point. No, I haven't seen that. I've heard that that's a great accompaniment to Leaving Neverland, though.
Well, I saw it before I saw Leaving Neverland. I think it really helped because the parents were even more monstrous in that movie, like way worse. I mean, the worst.
Mm-hmm.
Like at a certain point in the documentary, I was like screaming at the TV. And I'm
Oh
not
my
going to go into
God.
the way they acted, but there was very interesting parallels to the grooming because basically this family friend groomed both of the parents by getting both of them to get in sexual relationships with him first and then kidnapped the daughter and like groomed the daughter into thinking that she was part of some kind of destiny alien abduction plot where she was going to birth a new race of like savior human beings with him.
Wow.
And even when he
and
would
use
have
the stuff as blackmail, right?
and even when he would have sex with her, she was like a 12-year-old girl and he was a grown man. He wanted to make sure that it felt good for her and like wouldn't fully penetrate, like very concerned that it didn't hurt. Some of these pedophiles, they don't come off as these people who are pushing you up against the wall or assaulting you. I mean,
right.
So I think that's psychologically people, most people just aren't aware of that, how that dynamic plays out and how it can be very confusing, especially if you've buried a lot of these traumatic memories. How it can be very confusing to come to terms with that, especially if it wasn't physically painful.
Just like I don't know if you saw The Tale on HBO. I wouldn't recommend it. It's just intense in a different way. But Laura Dern plays Jennifer Fox, who was the director, and it's about her sexual assault as a child. But the movie begins with her a lot more mature looking because that's how she reflected on the relationship. Because just like Wade and James, she didn't understand that she was actually abused and raped by her coach. She thought that they were just in a special loving relationship. And so it's really interesting to see her. This is how she portrays what she thought it was. And this is how it really was. And then it like shows her then as what she really looked like. And it was like a prepubescent young girl, 12-year-old girl who hadn't reached puberty yet. And it's really disturbing. It's again, just the grooming and the fact that she never understood it was abuse. And she always just thought it was a special relationship with an older man and how it really destroyed her life. But it's really, I think it's just an incredibly important component to Me Too. It opens the conversation to something that's so crucial for us to discuss, considering 1 of 4 young girls are sexually assaulted and 1 in 6 boys are sexually assaulted. Talking about pedophilia and just child molestation in a general sense, less than 5% of men are born with this. And people who experience abuse in their childhood doesn't see this is a problem too, that we kind of excuse this behavior because we're like, oh, all of them are victims of abuse themselves and there's just a cycle of abuse. That's not true. People who experience abuse in their childhood, it does make it more likely to act on pedophilic urges, but in general this is not caused by abuse as children. There is something to say about the fact that women do not grow up to be pedophiles, or women are not born pedophiles. So there is some sort of weird genetic thing with men. I don't know if it's in part societal upbringing or the conditions of our society. I don't know if it's greater than mental illness, but it is not the same with women.
Yeah, and I also think we should make the distinction between the word pedophile and what people generally understand as a child molester, because a pedophile means someone who is sexually attracted to children. A lot of pedophiles actually don't act on their urges. They could have these feelings, and that could be their sexual preference, but not act on it. A child molester, generally speaking, is someone who engages in the act of child molestation. They might not even be a pedophile. It could just be someone who is a deranged, fucked up person who takes advantage of a young, vulnerable child out of some opportunistic situation. So there's a distinction to be made between the two, but it seems like Michael Jackson was definitely on some level both. I mean, but he was a very strong pedophile to the point where his entire life revolved around his desire to have these sexual relationships with young boys.
Right.
Like,
And-
not an exaggeration at all.
Right. And I don't know if anyone has had people in their lives who you found out had molested children, but I have. And it was, again, a big paradigm shift to me because this guy that I knew in San Diego did not look like a pedophile. He didn't act like a pedophile. We always just thought it was weird that he didn't have girlfriends because he was attractive, he was talented, and a lot of girls liked him. And he was always kind of asexual acting. And then I've come to find out he's in prison for oral copulation with a child under 10. But it is a paradigm shift in a lot of ways because, again, it's not obvious. You don't look at someone and you're like, oh, I can't trust him. He looks sketchy. He looks like he would molest a kid. No, that's not the way it works. And for people who are saying, oh, why did it take so long for these kids to come out? They must be lying. This woman who's the chief public affairs officer, Kristen Hauser from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, says it's completely normal. Adults who sexually abuse children intentionally confuse them, mixing up messages of love and friendship and abuse. The confusion can and does last long into adulthood. Another nonprofit called Darkness to Light that empowers adults to prevent child sexual abuse notes that only 38% of child sexual abuse victims disclose the abuse when they're children. Only 12% of child sexual abuse is ever reported to authorities. Take that in mind. And it really makes you kind of understand, you know, we discuss these kind of large abstract notions about social justice and progressivism and wanting to make the world a better place. And like this shit's happening in our back fucking yard, in our own families, in our own homes, in our own lives. And what does that do to a society? What does that do to an individual? What does that do to their extended families? What does this rampant abuse do, and our inability to have these discussions? And also the ability to discuss that pedophilia is a psychiatric disorder, and that people need help. You know, this is something that we should have open discussions about because there are resources available for people who have this. Of course, the people who aren't monsters and who won't act impulsively on, you know, and become child molesters. I mean, it is a thing. And the guilt and the shame can really destroy lives as well for people who don't act on these pedophilic urges like you're talking about. And so all of these things need to be discussed. We need to have resources available in our society. We need to have an open forum and discussion about this. Otherwise, it's not going to change, ever.
We just have such a warped view of sex still in our society that I don't even really know. You know, it's going to be a while before we can properly tackle this. But yeah, hopefully things like the subject material that this documentary is revealing will help educate people a little more on the nuances of this. There's just really no reason why a grown man would come out and make something like this up.
Right.
Even if there is a lawsuit. I mean, you can't... It's just such a bullshit argument to say, well, they're only in this for the money. Civil litigation is a powerful tool. If I was sexually abused by someone for 7 years, I would want to sue them too if it was beyond the statute of limitations or they were already dead or whatever. I mean, yeah. So...
I mean, the last thing I'll say to wrap it up is I thought it was just really strange that the Defend Assange, like the Assange defense team, actually directly responded to me. You know, here I am in minding my own business, talking about leaving Neverland, and they just responded to me directly, being like, documentaries, I don't even have the tweet pulled up, but they were just like, documentaries can make you believe anything if they're one-sided. And like basically alleging that Jackson was innocent and deciding to weigh in kind of a really bizarre way. Like, why are you guys talking about this when you should be focused on Assange's case? Like, why are you doing this? And then after they directly responded to me, clearly the same people running that account then posted from the WikiLeaks official account, making their own statement about, you know, basically alleging that Michael Jackson's innocent. And I found that odd, considering the official WikiLeaks account didn't have a problem propagating Pizzagate.
Just another example of how it's just totally a total shit show. They didn't even mention anything about those like Dark Overlord leaks, but I guess they're more concerned about pushing Michael Jackson's innocence. That just seems like a strange thing to get invested in. I don't know
Very
what the
strange.
fuck's going on, dude.
Very strange, dude. Well, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, if you haven't gone and seen this documentary yet, go check it out. It's 4 hours long, but it's worth watching the whole thing. I mean, it's just really fascinating, and it'll definitely shift some kind of, if you're open to the information and you believe what's being told on screen, you will have some kind of paradigm shift. If your primary thought about Michael Jackson wasn't, he is a serial child molester.
And I'm sorry for not offering a trigger warning before we started this podcast. We will in the description for anyone who was abused as a child, or sexually molested or raped. And if you do need help, if you are a victim and you have not spoken about this, there is an abuse hotline, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, and American SPCC that you can go to get more information. And there are just vast communities out there with resources ready to help you and anyone that you know that is in a similar situation. And you are not alone, and people are there ready to embrace you and to provide the help that you need. So please keep that in mind. And thank you so much for listening, you guys. It was a doozy, but anyone who's watched this, I think will appreciate it. You know what I mean?
One thing that this documentary sort of reveals is that these men didn't really come to terms with what had happened to them until they started seeking out therapy. I mean, actually specifically Wade. He had like a nervous breakdown. He went to a therapist, and it actually took him, I think, something like over a year to finally start opening up about what had happened between him and Michael Jackson. Don't hesitate going to see someone, especially if you have health insurance, it'll pay for it. And there's a lot of professionals out there who do things on a sliding scale if you have to pay out of pocket, and some very affordable ones out there as well. So that's always an option. And there's a lot of good resources in this country for mental health. It's just unfortunate that it most of the time costs money. Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Please donate, or consider donating to us on patreon.com/Media Roots Radio. And we have some amazing stickers that I'm going to put as a Patreon gift.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, dudes. Bye.